The man who found my daughter said she was lying face down in the gravel pull-off near the old Eganville Road, with one arm bent the wrong way, and that, if he hadn't stopped to check a loose tarp on his pulp truck, she would have been dead from the cold before anyone knew to look for her. I was putting up my storm windows when my phone rang. The voice on the other end was a paramedic, calm and professional the way they train them to be. He told me my daughter had been found injured, that she was conscious but disoriented, that they were taking her to Renfrew Victoria Hospital. He said the words significant trauma and possible fractures, and I don't remember setting down the putty knife or getting into my car. I just remember the highway, gray and wet, and my hands gripping the steering's wheel so hard, my knuckles ached the whole 40 minutes to Renfrew. She was in a curtained bay in the emergency department when I got there. Her face was swollen on one side, the left eye nearly shut, and there was a cut above her brow held together with 3 steri strips. She still had her good coat on, the charcoal wool one her husband had given her for Christmas, and it was filthy and torn at the shoulder. When she saw me, she started to cry without making any sound, and I sat on the edge of the bed and held her hand and waited. The story came out in pieces. She had found something in her husband's home office 3 weeks earlier, while looking for the property insurance renewal. A folder. She'd almost put it back without opening it, but the name on the tab caught her eye. The Hearth Foundation, Disbursement Ledger. She knew that name. Her mother-in-law ran the Hearth Foundation. It was her entire public identity, a charitable organization that helped rural seniors transition smoothly out of their family homes into assisted living, taking the burden of real estate off elderly people who were overwhelmed by the process. My daughter was an accountant, a good one. She could read a ledger the way I used to read a student's essay. She knew immediately when something was wrong. What she found was this: for 6 years, the Hearth Foundation had been systematically approaching vulnerable seniors across Eastern Ontario, offering to manage the sale of their properties as a free service. They'd send a trusted local contact, always a woman, always warm, always helpful, to visit the home, assess the property, and make a recommendation. The seniors, often widowed, often isolated, often frightened of the whole process, would sign over power of attorney for the transaction. Then the property would be listed not at fair market value, but at a figure 15, sometimes 20% below it. The gap between what the senior received and what the eventual buyer paid went into accounts connected to holding companies that traced back, through 2 layers of numbered corporations, to my son-in-law's mother. She had stolen from lonely old people. She had taken from farmers and retired teachers and war widows who had trusted her because she had a kind face, it's in a glossy pamphlet, and a foundation with a comforting name. My daughter said she had confronted her about it 2 weeks ago. Not angrily. That was never her way, quietly. She'd asked for an explanation. Her mother-in-law had gone still, the way water goes still before a current takes it, and then she'd smiled and said there must be a misunderstanding, and that they should take a drive out toward the Bonnechere Valley together, to look at a property the foundation was considering. She said she would explain everything on the way. My daughter had gone. She trusted her. She was carrying the woman's grandchild 12 weeks along, and she'd told her in the car, thinking it would soften things, that it might matter. It didn't matter. Somewhere on a gravel side road off the Eganville Road, her mother-in-law had stopped the car, gotten out, and hit her with a tire iron before she even had the door open. She'd said, while she was hitting her, that my daughter came from nothing, that our family were backwoods schoolteachers, and that her great-grandmother had been a Métis woman who'd had no business marrying into any decent family, and that the child she was carrying would be better off never being born than carrying that into their bloodline. My daughter stopped speaking for a moment. Then she said, "I thought she was going to kill me." She left when her phone rang. She just answered it and walked away and drove off. I held her hand and did not say anything for a long time. The emergency department hummed around us. Somewhere behind another curtain, a child was crying. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years teaching English literature at a secondary school in Killaloe. I raised my daughter alone after her father passed when she was 11, and I did it without asking for help I hadn't earned. I have always believed, because my grandmother taught me to believe, that a quiet life and honest work are enough, that patience is a virtue, that the truth eventually surfaces. But sitting in that hospital bay, looking at my daughter's face, I felt something shift in me that I don't know how to describe, except to say it was like a furnace door opening. Not rage, not grief. Something older and quieter than either of those things. I told her not to speak to her husband yet. Told her to say, for now, that she hadn't seen who had forced her off the road. I told her I was sorry to ask that of her. She nodded. She said, I have photographs. She had photographed every page of the folder before she'd put it back. 41 photographs. Ledgers, transfer documents holding company registrations, correspondence between her mother-in-law and a numbered company in Toronto. It wasn't a complete picture, but it was enough to know where to look. Then she said something that made everything else stop. This isn't the first time I've lost something because of her, Mum. I asked her what she meant. She told me about the miscarriage 2 years ago, the one the doctors had called unexplained, the one she'd blamed herself for, the stress of work, the travel, her own body failing her. She'd been staying with her in-laws for a month while their condo was being renovated, and her mother-in-law had been attentive, making meals, bringing herbal teas, being, my daughter had thought, kind. She'd recently found a receipt tucked inside a book she'd borrowed from her in-law's shelf and only just returned. A receipt from a naturopath in Ottawa for a specific botanical compound known, she'd looked it up, to cause uterine contractions in early pregnancy. I don't know how long I sat without speaking. Long enough that my daughter squeezed my hand and said, quietly, Mum, I'm okay. I said, I know you are. I called my sister from the hospital parking lot. She lives in Kingston and was in her car within 40 minutes of my call. She is 3 years older than me, retired now, but she spent 22 years as a Crown attorney with the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General. She knows how evidence works. She knows how people who have done terrible things try to make it disappear. She arrived at the hospital at 11:30 that night. She sat with my daughter for a long time and didn't say very much. When she came out to the corridor where I was waiting, her face was composed and precise, the way it always gets when she is working something out. She can't go home, my sister said. I know. And we can't go to the police yet, not with what we have. They'd look at it and see a family dispute and a woman who can afford very good lawyers, and your daughter would be back in that house before the week was out. Then, what do we do? My sister was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you know what I think we do. We took my daughter to my house in Killaloe that night. My sister drove ahead to check the route. She'd always been more careful than me that way. I helped my daughter into the passenger seat, propped a pillow behind her damaged shoulder, and drove the back road slowly. The Ottawa Valley was dark around us. The spruce stands black against a sky full of hard autumn stars. At the house, I made tea, and my sister sat at the kitchen table with my daughter's phone and went through the photographs methodically, making notes on a yellow legal pad she'd pulled from her bag. I set up the guest room and found my daughter's old university sweatshirt in a cedar chest and brought it down for her. Before she fell asleep, my daughter said, he didn't know. About the miscarriage, I mean, I think. I said I hoped she was right. My sister worked through most of the night. By the time I came downstairs at 6 a.m, she had 3 pages of notes and had already made 2 calls to a forensic accountant she'd worked with on a fraud case in Belleville and a retired detective in Ottawa who now did private investigations. "The holding companies are sloppy," she said when I brought her coffee. "Not enough layers. Someone got greedy and cut corners." With the right people looking at the transaction records and the land registry filings, this comes apart quickly. She paused. "There's also a developer in Ottawa named in the correspondence. He's been the buyer of record on 4 of these properties. If he understands what we have, he becomes a problem for her." "What about my son-in-law's father?" I asked. She looked at me steadily. "That's what I've been thinking about." My son-in-law's father was not a warm man. I had met him perhaps 8 times in the 5 years my daughter had been married, and he had always been correct and unreachable. The way certain men of his generation are, men who built things and considered the building sufficient communication. He ran a property development firm out of Toronto. He and his wife had lived separately for several years, though they had never formally separated. Their arrangement was, I gathered, convenient for both of them. He would not be comfortable being told his wife had been defrauding elderly Ontarians through a charitable vehicle attached to his family's name. He would be even less comfortable knowing it could become public. We did not go to him in anger. That was my sister's insistence, and she was right. We went with documents and a quiet, specific request. She arranged the meeting through a former colleague who had done legal work for his firm. We met him at a hotel in Ottawa in a private dining room on a Wednesday afternoon 2 weeks after my daughter had been found on that gravel road. My daughter was with us. Her arm was in a sling and the bruising had faded to yellow-green, and she sat very straight across the table from her father-in-law and did not look away from him. He studied the photographs. He listened to my sister's summary without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, precise and legal in their framing, and my sister answered them. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at my daughter and said, "I am sorry this was done to you." She said, "I believe you." He asked what we wanted. We told him, a clean divorce, with a settlement that reflected the genuine value of my daughter's 5 years of contribution to his son's life and household. Full legal separation from any foundation liability. And a guarantee, legally binding through whatever mechanism his lawyers could construct, that his wife would have no further contact with my daughter or her child. In return, we would not go to the Crown. We would not contact the media. We would not approach the elderly families whose properties had been taken below value, though I told him plainly that I believed he should. He said he would need a week. He needed 4 days. His wife was removed from the Hearth Foundation's board within the week. The foundation was dissolved by the end of November, its remaining assets directed to the Renfrew County Legal Clinic by order of its own trustees, who had apparently been watching the accounts with growing unease for some time, and needed very little persuading once a conversation began. My son-in-law's father personally contacted 2 of the seniors, whose properties had sold below value, and arranged for supplemental payments. I don't know if he reached all the others. I chose to believe he tried. My son-in-law contested nothing. I think he had known, in the way people know things they have decided not to look at directly, that something was wrong. When my sister's forensic accountant found one additional detail, a joint account in Niagara on the lake, in the name of his mother and a man 20 years, her junior who managed 2 of the holding companies. My son-in-law apparently sat in his lawyer's office for a very long time without speaking, and then signed the divorce papers that same afternoon. My daughter moved back to Killaloe in December. I gave her the back bedroom, the one that faces the garden, and we turned the small room beside it into a nursery over Christmas. My sister came for the holiday, and the 3 of us put up the wallpaper ourselves. Yellow, with small white birch trees on it, and drank cider and argued pleasantly about whether the border was level. My son-in-law's father called in January to ask about the baby. He was careful and formal, and I could hear that he was trying. My daughter took the phone from me and spoke with him briefly and told him the due date and said she would let him know when the child arrived. When she hung up, she looked at the phone for a moment and then set it on the counter and went back to the book she'd been reading. "He's not a bad man," she said. "He just spent 30 years looking the other way." "A lot of people do," I said. "I know, but he stopped." My granddaughter was born on a Saturday in late April in Renfrew Victoria Hospital. The same hospital where I had first held my daughter's hand in a curtained bay and felt that furnace door open. She was small and loud and entirely certain of her own importance from the first breath. We named her after my grandmother. Not her French name, which was too formal, but the name her family had used at home. A short, plain, Algonquin-inflected name that my grandmother had carried her whole life, with complete indifference to whether anyone around her found it easy to say. My son-in-law's mother had called that heritage something to be ashamed of. She had called it small and backward, and beneath her family's standing. My granddaughter screams in the night and grabs my finger with her whole fist and looks at me with dark, furious, ancient eyes, and I think, there is nothing small about this. My grandmother survived things that would have finished most people. She passed that capacity down through my mother and into me, and I passed it to my daughter without knowing quite how I did it. And now it is here, again, in this small, fierce person who arrived in April and turned my whole house inside out and is going to be, I am entirely certain, absolutely relentless. My sister comes every other weekend. She sits in the garden when the weather allows and holds the baby with the same precision she brings to everything. And last week she said quietly that she thought this was the best case she had ever worked. I told her it wasn't a case, it was our family. She said, "Same thing in the end." She wasn't wrong. The people who came after us assumed we would scatter, that we were too ordinary, too rural, too small in the ways that they measured smallness. They did not know what had been handed down to us. They did not know what we were capable of when someone we loved needed us to remember. Now they do.